Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at bitesizedbiographies.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part one of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject. Public enemy number one, John Dillinger. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Bite-Sized Biographies, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. And please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on Spotify. And also tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies. Now let's get started with our story about John Dillinger. It is not a coincidence that America's largest crime wave started in 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, with most Americans blaming banks and financial institutions for the nation's catastrophic economic downturn. There was little sympathy for an industry that was repeatedly victimized by armed robberies, with several high-profile criminals achieving national celebrity, including Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, George Machine Gun Kelly, Bonnie Parker, Clyde Barrow, the Barker Gang, and Alvin Karpis. The most infamous criminal from this time period was John Dillinger. Dillinger and his bank robbery exploits and spectacular escapes from both police dragnets and even maximum security prisons propelled him to notoriety as America's public enemy number one. This high profile was achieved despite spending 9.5 years of his 12-year criminal career in prison, and his assassination only 13 months after his first bank robbery. Despite this brevity, Dillinger's persona electrified most Americans who considered him a modern-day tabloid Robin Hood, defying a rigged financial system and a symbol of ineffectual federal and state law enforcement. John Dillinger was born on June 22, 1903, in Indianapolis, Indiana. At the time of his birth, his father, John Sr., the son of a German immigrant, owned a small grocery store. Typically, he and his wife, Molly, lived next door in the Oak Hills section of the rapidly growing city. John Jr.'s sister, Audrey, was born in 1889 and was 13 years older than her younger brother. Dillinger's mother died aged 36 when he was 4 years old, and until his father remarried, he was raised by his older sister, who was already married at the time of Molly's death. Although her first child died shortly after childbirth, Audrey eventually gave birth to 7 children. John Sr. would also remarry and produce 3 half-siblings for John Jr., and how exactly the young Dillinger felt about all of this obvious domestic turmoil and how he was treated during his childhood is anecdotally confusing. Whether his parents, especially his father, were strict, preoccupied, or even aloof has never been specifically documented, but the result was pretty apparent. From a young age, Dillinger Jr. frequently ran away from home, engaged in destructive pranks, and ignored any corporal punishment, even as it escalated with age and the severity of his transgressions, to the extent that his father eventually threw up his hands at his inability to positively influence his son. When John Jr. announced at age 16 that he hated school, most likely because it required that he sit still and pay attention, and was going to drop out and get a job, his father didn't bother attempting to persuade him otherwise. What followed was a succession of menial blue-collar jobs in which he performed reasonably well, but mostly out of boredom. He quickly quit and moved on to another seemingly more attractive situation. At age 17, Dillinger Jr.'s father decided to buy a farm in rural Mooresville, Indiana. on the outskirts of Indianapolis. He and his wife also joined a Quaker-affiliated local church. Several of their children, including John Jr., still lived at home, with the younger Dillinger working at a nearby machine shop, which he eventually commuted to, first by his own motorcycle and then in his own Chevy. Although he seemed to be learning a trade and worked consistently at the same shop for several years, at age 20, Dillinger evinced an erratic side that prompted him to commit what can only be described as antisocial behavior. In July of 1923, armed with a pistol, he stole a car that was parked near his family's local Quaker outpost and drove it into central Indianapolis and began wandering through a seedy neighborhood in which he would have seemed completely out of place. Stopped by two policemen who questioned him as to what he was up to and where he was from, his suspicious responses prompted a pat-down, which revealed the handgun. Dillinger managed to escape from the two cops intent on his arrest, but times being what they were, they actually fired pistol shots at him as he fled, which he managed to dodge. Hiding out for a brief period, he solved his short-term problem as a fugitive by resorting to a typical solution of the time period, joining the Navy. Recruiters were not particularly analytical or selective, and in less than a week, John Dillinger was deposited in the Great Lakes Naval Training Center on the shores of Lake Michigan, just north of Chicago. By October of 1923, Dillinger was finished with basic training and officially assigned to the battleship Utah, designated as a fireman third class, responsible for shoveling coal into the interior of the giant warship. It took all of 3 weeks for the recently minted sailor to decide that he needed an unauthorized break from his arduous routine, going AWOL in Boston for a brief period. Upon his return, he was officially court-martialed, fined a month's pay, and tossed in the brig for 10 days. An administrative holdup of the sentence's implementation prompted Dillinger to additionally vacate his post inappropriately and be charged officially with disobedience of orders, incurring an additional 5 days of solitary confinement. This punishment probably only served to confirm to Dillinger that the Navy wasn't for him. In early December, after a 24-hour leave, he went AWOL again and literally disappeared, the Navy officially designating him as a deserter. For several months, even his own family assumed that he was still serving in the military. Instead, he was actually surreptitiously couch surfing in Indianapolis until in March of 2024, when he reunited with his family in Mooresville, claiming an honorable discharge over a heart condition. Apparently, the Navy did not make much of an effort in attempting to locate him, Dillinger openly residing in the family home and returning to his normal routine. By April 1924, he was married to a 17-year-old Beryl Horvius, the couple first living with Dillinger's family and then getting their own apartment, funded by Dillinger's sporadic blue-collar employment. The marriage was immediately rocky, Dillinger staying out to all hours of the night and his wife assuming that her husband was chasing other women, Beryl repeatedly complaining to her father-in-law about this behavior. The older Dillinger attempted to discuss this issue with his son, but the newlywed virtually ignored him and explained that he was merely playing cards with some buddies. Actually, Dillinger was engaging in some of his first criminal activity, low-level crimes involving penny ante burglary. Even he realized that to achieve any kind of real results, he would need a more experienced Confederate, which he located in the person of a distant relative named William Edgar Singleton. Eddie, as he was known locally, had a reputation as a wise guy who had actually spent time in prison, probably not the best indicator of future criminal success, but impressive to Dillinger nonetheless. The big score they planned was the assault and robbery of a local grocer named Frank Morgan, an individual in his mid-60s who typically took home his daily cash receipts on his person. On the evening of September 6, 1924, Dillinger and Singleton followed Morgan as he emerged from a local barber shop. Singleton then heading to the duo's getaway car as Dillinger hid in some bushes waiting for Morgan. As planned, when Morgan passed by, Dillinger emerged from hiding and hit the man in the head with a large bolt wrapped in a handkerchief. As the man fell to the pavement and tried to stand up, Dillinger hit him again and then drew a pistol, demanding Morgan's cash. Instead of meekly complying, the grocer began grappling with his assailant, and the gun went off, a bullet harmlessly striking the pavement. On a residential street, the noise prompted local inhabitants to emerge from their homes in an attempt to identify the source of the disturbance. Dillinger then decided to break off the robbery and hastily began running towards his nearby alley rendezvous with his wheelman. Unfortunately for Dillinger, at the sound of gunfire, Singleton immediately fled, leaving his conspirator to fend for himself. Dillinger then repaired to a nearby pool hall, his blood-stained attire raising enough suspicion that he eventually realized he had no choice but to hoof it on his own back to his father's house, where he figured he could ride out what he hoped would be a brief storm. With a good description of Dillinger from individuals at the pool hall, and Dillinger already having gained a locally bad reputation, it wasn't long before he was arrested by the sheriff's department. Although he didn't fold under several days of incarceration, his father visited him in the Mooresville jail and recommended that he confess if he did the crime, convincing Dillinger that the law would go easy on him. Dillinger then agreed to plead guilty, foolishly doing so without retaining a lawyer. His associate Singleton, who Dillinger implicated, at least worldly enough to retain counsel and get a continuance. Unfortunately, the judge that sentenced Dillinger was an elected official who was not about to go easy on what was a brazen and brutal assault of a solid citizen. On account of conspiracy to commit a felony, the sentence was 2 to 14 years. But for assault with intent to rob, Dillinger got 10 to 20 years. And although the judge made the sentences concurrent, the 10 to 20 meant Dillinger would have to serve a minimum of 10 years in prison. He was quickly transported to a prison facility 25 miles from Indianapolis. News of Dillinger's incarceration bureaucratically made its way to the Navy, who then officially dishonorably discharged him. A prison physical quickly determined that Dillinger was suffering from gonorrhea, which in a pre-penicillin world required treatment consisting of silver nitrate injected into the urethra. When he wasn't enduring this kind of physical therapy, Dillinger attempted several cursory attempts at escape, which merely added more time to his official sentence. A bout with diphtheria momentarily put a halt to his rebellious attitude, but he resumed official misbehavior when he learned of Singleton's parole only a couple of years into his sentence. Visits from his family, after initial frequents, began to dwindle, and his wife eventually filed for divorce in April of 1929, remarrying a week later. When Dillinger finally did come up for parole in July of 1929, his official chances at an early release would have to be regarded as slim, and his continued defiance behind bars generated a quick rejection. Dillinger then requested a transfer to the state penitentiary at Michigan City, Indiana. This was the kind of intransigent and self-destructive act that had marked Dillinger's life up to this point. Historically, the legend goes that the felon wanted to play on the institution's talented baseball team, but his ability in this sport was completely glorified, and Dillinger never even played on the team. His previous institution was filled with mostly youthful offenders, and as an individual in his 20s, Dillinger was housed in an environment that at least had some focus on rehabilitation and was relatively benign. The state penitentiary was a maximum security facility housing the most hardened criminals in the state. Perhaps that was the convict's goal all along: to interact with other professional crooks who would be much more experienced and a collaborative resource when Dillinger emerged from incarceration. The prison also supplied cheap labor to various local industries, including a shirt factory where Dillinger quickly excelled, doubling his quota of requisite output and assisting other cons in meeting theirs. The outlaw both ingratiated himself with prison staff and quickly cultivated relationships with the type of experienced convicts who were familiar with especially robbing banks. These individuals included men like Harry Pete Pierpont and Homer Van Meter, individuals destined to eventually become part of the robbery crew that Dillinger ultimately assembled. But first, Dillinger had to make parole, and while improving his productivity, he also minimized the types of infractions that marked the first few years of his sentence. Vowing to his family that he intended to go straight, they enthusiastically helped him line up positive letters of recommendation from various law enforcement figures and politicians. Because he had not served his minimum 10-year sentence in April of 1933, Dillinger submitted his request for release to the governor's three-man clemency commission. This was a break, as the parole board would be familiar with both Dillinger's record and behavioral issues that initially marked his confinement. Although the clemency commission voted in favor of Dillinger's release, the bureaucratic process of granting a specific release date could drag on for weeks. Despite the news that his stepmother had suffered a serious stroke and probably would not survive, Dillinger was not able to return home in time to see Lizzie Dillinger before she passed away on May 22, 1933. Although his family was happy about his release, other members of the community weren't so supportive, not believing that Dillinger had significantly changed and believing his vow to go straight nothing but a facade. Realistically, it was probably apparent rather quickly to Dillinger that his prospects for traditional success were rather limited. At the height of the Depression, most unskilled middle-class Americans had difficulty finding steady employment. An ex-con with a serious felony conviction would only be less likely to find a reasonable job. Dillinger also understood that while he was in prison, more modern automobiles and armaments, including such weapons as the Thompson submachine gun, allowed bandits an edge in exploiting the poorly secured banks of the time period, especially those in rural areas, far from any immediate high-profile law enforcement. It was only a matter of weeks before Dillinger attempted his first robbery, but perhaps because he was not sure if he could pull off a bank robbery, Dillinger reverted back to his amateurish penny-ante ways, hooking up with some younger hoods and robbing an all-night grocery store in Indianapolis. The total cash obtained was about $100, and Dillinger had to pistol whip an old man in the process. His take for the evening and the risk of another long stretch in the penitentiary was $30. Dillinger included one of his associates from the grocery store heist, 19-year-old Willie the Kid Shaw, in his next job, a drugstore robbery, again another practically pitiful effort that yielded less than $100. Shortly after this caper, Shaw, Dillinger, and another wheelman set upon another Indianapolis grocery market. But this Kroger location had been robbed so many times that the cash was systematically removed from the registers by management and conveyed to a central location. This time the haul was mostly some cigarette containers that Shaw figured was at least worth something. One of the reasons that crooks like Dillinger had trouble locating suitable banks to rob was that in 1933, many of these institutions were insolvent and closed. Frequently, while attempting to case a bank that his mates in prison had listed as an easy score, Dillinger would arrive only to find the place boarded up and out of business. His robbery antics of the next few weeks reflected this reality. With mostly his Confederate Shaw, he robbed a fruit market and even a sandwich shop. Predictably, Shaw and some of the other members of this minor league crew were soon arrested by police. Dillinger fortunate not to be in the vicinity when the pinch went down. Dillinger decided that it would be unwise to continue to hang out in the vicinity of Indianapolis. So with another criminal, Harry Copeland, the two decided to hide out in Muncie and plan a bank heist in tiny Daleville, Indiana. And so it was on July 17, 1933, at 12:45 p.m., Dillinger by himself walked into the commercial bank of Daleville, headed up to the only teller on duty, and took out a pistol. To the bank employee, one Margaret Good, he barked, "Honey, this is a stick-up. Get me the money." With Copeland watching through a window, her co-workers all on a lunch break, the clerk gave him everything she had in her cash drawer. When Dillinger requested she let him into her work area through a locked door, she claimed she didn't have a key. With that, Dillinger spontaneously pulled himself up to the top of the gilded barrier that shielded the teller windows, threw his leg over, and jumped down into the restricted area, a technique that he perfected, eventually earning the media nickname the Jackrabbit. Gaining access to the vaults and accompanied by Ms. Good, Dillinger took more cash, some diamond rings, and even a coin collection. When a patron strolled into the lobby, Copeland emerged from the robber's getaway vehicle, pulled his gun, and quickly ordered the man into a corner of the lobby, escorting two other prospective bank customers into the same area when they entered the building. When he was finished, Dillinger and Copeland got everyone into the area behind the cages and shut the door, admonishing the citizens not to emerge. The duo then got in their car and took off, the robbery netting the pair about $3,500, a sizable payday and a great improvement over Dillinger's previous efforts. Only 2 days later, Dillinger and Copeland attempted a repeat at the Rockville National Bank in Rockville, Indiana, another rural outpost about 60 miles due west of Indianapolis. Dillinger, during lunch hour, again walked casually into the bank, sharply dressed in a tan suit and hat, and walked right up to bank president A.C. Craze, telling the banker to hit the floor. Copeland retrieved a secretary from the bank's interior offices, but did not observe Cray's son Roland, who, alerted by the noise of the stick-up, retrieved his own .38 pistol from his desk and was now aiming through a small opening in one of the doors to the lobby, eventually shooting at Copeland's head. He barely missed, the bullet penetrating one of the bank's large glass windows. Although Copeland froze, Dillinger became enraged and was on the younger bank employee before he could react, the bank robber placing his pistol in Roland's midsection and pulling the trigger. The gun misfired, so Dillinger pistol-whipped Craze into the street while Copeland lifted any obvious cash. But, spooked by the gunshot, he left quickly with only a modest $140. Dillinger stayed longer, but also wasn't able to grab much else. He also quickly jumped into the getaway car, and Copeland sped away rapidly. Foolishly, the only pursuer was Roland Craze, who commandeered a local's car and tried to follow the two crooks, who quickly outdistanced him, and then switched from their stolen Plymouth to a Chrysler Imperial concealed earlier. After paying for gas, Dillinger and Copeland had $60 each. Perhaps bank robbery would not be so easy after all. Thinking that a little more planning and preparation might be productive, Copeland and Dillinger and an unidentified wheelman then selected another target, the First National Bank of Montpelier, Indiana. Montpelier was another tiny community about 100 miles northeast of Indianapolis. On the afternoon of August 4th, Copeland and Dillinger both entered the bank with guns drawn and quickly confronted the bank president and the firm's cashiers. Announcing that they were there to stick up the bank, Dillinger leapt over the cage and had the president lead him into the vault. $6,200 later, he then began working on the individual cash drawers, dumping $3,900 more into the large sack he brought with him for this purpose. He also stumbled upon a .45 caliber pistol, which also went into the sack. Dillinger, having gotten wise to another possible source of loot, then asked about the bank's portfolio of government bonds, which could be fenced for cash. The bank president responded by saying they were kept off-site in a Fort Wayne location. The outlaws accepted the explanation. Not having the time to check on its veracity, they quickly fled, hopping into their getaway car, a stolen Dodge, the wheelman putting the pedal to the metal. The Dodge was found 100 miles away, exchanged for another vehicle, the crew pulling off a $10,000 bank robbery. They had no idea how fortunate they were to not only get their hands on such a large amount of cash, but they also avoided the inhabitants of the police chief's office, which was on the second floor above the bank. Several years before the successful Dillinger robbery, 3 men had attempted a similar robbery. The mayor and the chief responded with long guns stored on site, killing one criminal on the spot and arresting the 2 others. Fortunately for Dillinger and his associates, the mayor, a lawyer, was out of town on business, and the police chief was on site several blocks away at a municipal construction project. Otherwise, his storied career might have had a much different and shorter outcome. Dillinger's exploits, as well as the efforts of other bank robbers, prompted a response from both the banks themselves and the insurance companies that were frequently forced to replace stolen money. With zero confidence that ordinary police, either incompetent or corrupt, would be able to track down the more effective thieves, the Indiana Bankers Association retained private detectives, usually ex-Pinkerton employees, who were thorough and ruthless. These men were able to trace Dillinger and his cronies' potential residences in places like Muncie and Fort Wayne, but they also determined that Dillinger was getting tips from law enforcement itself, obtained via either bribes or services from local prostitutes. Eager to expand his operations to surrounding states to avoid any predictability, on August 14th, Dillinger and 4 other men pulled up in front of the Citizens National Bank of Bluffton, Ohio. 2 of these men remained at the front entrance. The other 3 implemented a more intricate scheme than Dillinger typically invoked. While one accomplice quietly requested change for a $5 bill from a teller and then quietly informed the individual that the bank was being robbed, Dillinger then vaulted into the cage and at pistol point, ordering all of the bank's employees onto the ground. Methodically, he began emptying the cash drawers into the usual sack, but immediately became agitated over the small amount of cash present. Barking at one employee, he demanded to know where the rest of the money was. The terrified individual merely pointed in the direction of the bank's vault area. While Dillinger thought about how to access the large safe, an alarm started loudly sounding from the outside of the building, which then prompted a local utility company whistle to also sound. Soon gunfire was audible from outside, and while Dillinger did not know that this was his own men firing at any curious individuals heading near the bank's vicinity, he eventually reasoned that he better settle for a modest haul of $2,100 and get out of the area, the entire stick-up lasting about 5 minutes. Random shots from the 5 individuals as they left wound up shattering shop windows and lodging dangerously in nearby residences, but no one was killed. Although another tactic from law enforcement of setting up roadblocks in nearby towns, sealing off potential escape routes, was implemented, the Dillinger crew evaded any such impediment. Another technique of bank robbers of the period was to not only case banks thoroughly, but to also develop an escape route, avoiding main roads and accessing less traveled byways. Although he had again successfully pulled off another robbery, Dillinger was under the scrutiny of a determined effort by various public and private entities that were pressuring incarcerated former associates and even monitoring known Dillinger female interests in Indiana and Ohio. None of these panned out before September 6th, when unpredictably, Dillinger and 2 others identified as John Vincent and getaway driver Hilton Crouch set their sights on a bank in Indianapolis, the Massachusetts Avenue State Bank, a location that would confuse their pursuers, who believed Dillinger was only targeting regional small financial institutions in rural areas. This time, while Vincent kept employees at bay, Dillinger not only emptied out the cash drawers, he also got access to the bank's vault and was able to toss several large bags of cash out of the cage area and in Vincent's direction. The 2 men then quickly hopped back into their DeSoto as Crouch took off, heading for Chicago as quickly as possible. The robbery returned over $24,000, Dillinger's largest score to date. Although it is not certain, it is possible that Dillinger followed this robbery up with another heist in Farrell, Pennsylvania, although the shotgun murder of a guard did not conform to Dillinger's relatively benign approach when it came to actually shooting it out. Typically, he only did that when provoked, as he was in Rockland, Indiana. In any case, Dillinger's luck was about to run out. He had developed a romance with the sister of a convict he met while confined in Michigan City, a 23-year-old woman named Mary Longenecker, that Dillinger had previously taken to the Chicago World's Fair. Local police were already staking out her apartment as prison snitches and other informants told investigators that Dillinger was involved with Mary and already had visited her in Dayton. Following up, they obtained her location by screening the mail of her jailed brother, which contained her return address. Although the 2 cops assigned to surveillance on the night of September 22nd got bored and went home, When Dillinger showed up at midnight, the landlady recognized him and called the police. A search of the apartment in Dillinger revealed numerous pistols. He was quickly handcuffed and taken to jail. Numerous members of law enforcement in jurisdictions throughout the Midwest interested in asking about various crimes he may or may not have committed. Before his arrest, Dillinger was involved in the illicit delivery of 3 .38 caliber pistols concealed in a seemingly innocent crate containing 200 pounds of thread destined for the Michigan City Prison shirt manufacturing facility staffed by the inmates. One of the 11 prisoners who was planning a breakout that would spring a total of 11 men included a close prison associate of Dillinger and a veteran bank robber, Harry Pete Pierpont. These 11 cons, mostly hardened criminals with long sentences, cooked up an elaborate plan that had them kidnapping a couple of guards at gunpoint, having it look as if the guards were escorting them while they moved piles of seemingly finished shirts across the prison courtyard until they got to the office near the main gate. There, they would use the threat of gunfire and brute force to bust out of the prison itself. Although audacious, the plan seemed to have little chance of success and probably would only wind up in getting both more guards and inmates killed. But on September 26, 1933, Pierpont and his crew, now down a man when one potential escapee was confined to the prison hospital with suspected tuberculosis, took their shot. Incredibly, all 10 men were able to escape, and despite having to shoot 2 guards, separate into 2 groups, and hijack transportation, usually at the point of a gun, 8 of the 10 men were able to elude capture, and by early October, 6, including Harry Pierpont, were situated in a hideout in Hamilton, Ohio. At this point, Ohio had won the judicial scrap over who would get to prosecute Dillinger first. He was by now, especially after his associates, known as the Terrible 10, broke out of jail, a celebrity getting substantial press coverage. In a media world dominated by newspapers and a colorful bank robber, the perfect tabloid material, Dillinger and his unpredictable and daring bravado ripping off banks for big money was sensational journalism. Law enforcement, personified by the likes of the not particularly effective head of the Indiana State Police named Matt Leach, who became so stressed out by his inability to catch Dillinger, he developed a noticeable stammer. When speaking with the press, provided a practically comic foil to Dillinger's Robin Hood. Leach reacted angrily to Ohio getting physical control of Dillinger, stating that the Michigan City escapees would be dead set on springing the outlaw as soon as possible, a task made easier by Ohio law enforcement stashing the bank robber in county jails that had nowhere near the security of a large state penitentiary. A sense of unease pervaded law enforcement connected to the case when on September 27th, in the middle of a preliminary hearing concerning Dillinger's participation in the Bluffton, Ohio bank robbery, the defendant unpredictably pled guilty. Observers wondered if it was part of some larger plan. Under tight security, he was then moved to another county seat and jail in Lima, Ohio. Matt Leach turned out to be more astute than usual. Needing a bankroll, on October 2nd, Pierpont and 2 other members of the Terrible 10, Russell Clark and John Hamilton, robbed a St. Mary's, Ohio bank, the First National Bank of St. Mary's, of $15,000. By October 11th, Pierpont and additional members of his crew were in Lima, already casing the county jail. The next day, late in the day, 5 men led by Pierpont made their way back to Lima. Aware that the sheriff, Jeff Sarber, actually had a residence in the jail, Pierpont and 2 others knew they needed a ruse to try and sweet-talk Sarber into releasing Dillinger into their custody, or at least not suspect them on sight. Sarber was reading the newspaper in the office that was then in the front part of his residence when he observed 3 well-dressed men entering the hallway. His wife Lucy was also present, having just served dinner to her husband and an off-duty deputy sheriff. Sarber wasn't particularly suspicious, and even after Pierpont explained that they were Michigan City prison officials who needed to remove Dillinger back to their facility in Indiana, he merely asked them for some proper identification. Pierpont took out his .38 and pointed it at the sheriff, telling him that this was all the credentials he needed. When Sarber responded by reaching for his desk drawer, undoubtedly to produce his own firearm, Pierpont, not noted for his impulse control, shot the sheriff in the abdomen. Despite being seriously wounded and falling backwards onto the floor, the sheriff tried to stand up as another attacker, Charles Mackley, came around the desk and pistol-whipped Sarber to the ground, Pierpont demanding the keys to the cell block. The deputy sheriff present, Willard Sharp, stood up, initially preparing to retrieve his own weapon when Mackley pointed his gun at him and told him to sit down. Off duty, in civilian clothes, Sharp must have been mistaken for a prisoner orderly, as Mackley would not have hesitated to shoot him otherwise. After Pierpont pistol-whipped the unresponsive Sarber several more times and even shot at him 2 more times, mostly for effect as he missed and the unresponsive sheriff absorbing a terrible beating, his wife told Pete to stop and that she would get the keys. Following her to a cupboard, he spotted them hanging from the wall, took them, and headed to the cell block. Upon hearing the gunshots, Dillinger left the card game in the day room, returned to his cell, and put on his jacket. It wasn't long before Pierpont materialized. Dillinger acknowledged him, and Pete handed him one of the jailer's pistols. When the other prisoners started heading in their general direction, assuming that they were also free to go, Pierpont fired a warning shot that scattered them back to their own cells, yelling that he was only here for Dillinger. Although taken aback by the sight of Sarber, who he actually got along with, Dillinger agreed that Lucy and Deputy Sharp needed to be locked in the cell block. Sarber was no threat, as he was already telling his wife that he was going to die at any minute. When Sarber's wife begged to be allowed to stay, Pierpont shook his head and pushed her behind bars. Most of the criminals jumped into one of the 2 getaway cars, Pierpont and Dillinger sharing the same vehicle. Dillinger was angry about the excessive violence, but didn't make much of an issue of it on the way back to Hamilton. Pierpont and company had rescued him from a certain lengthy jail sentence, if not worse. But only hours later, Jess Sarber died from injuries to his skull inflicted during the probably unnecessary and brutal beating. Instead of an amazing daredevil rescue, the newspapers and angry citizenry were infuriated by the violent, thuggish behavior. Having already commented on numerous occasions about his son's exploits, even John Dillinger Sr. didn't have much of anything positive to say other than, "I don't know what to think, but it's pretty bad." Any anger that Dillinger must have felt was probably quickly assuaged by Pierpont's thoughtful arrangement of the presence of another Dillinger love interest at the Hamilton hideout, that of Mary Billy Frechette, part Native American and a cabaret dancer, when she met Dillinger, their relationship sporadic due to the outlaw's unpredictable schedule. But the couple was certainly happy to see each other and spent a great deal of time together, privately getting reacquainted. While angry law enforcement and the citizens of Lima buried their respected sheriff, Dillinger and Pierpont added to their notoriety by attempting an especially insolent takedown, this time not of a merchant or financial institution, but on October 14th of an actual police station in Auburn, Indiana, the tiny town's station house having only 2 policemen on duty at the time. These 2 were no match for the brazen criminals who quickly disarmed and locked them in their own holding cell. Accompanied by Charlie Mackley, Dillinger and Pierpont subsequently unlocked the vast police department gun cabinet and made off with all kinds of armaments, including numerous pistols, rifles, shotguns, bulletproof vests, and even a Thompson submachine gun. Dillinger, who actually enjoyed his public notoriety, most likely knew that such impudence would cause even a bigger public sensation, and he was correct. It was as if he and his gang were now an unstoppable force. So what to do to follow up this sensation? Well, rob another police station in Peru, Indiana, and completely lift the entire armory again. This happened a few days later, late at night, with only a few policemen on duty. The haul included numerous high-powered weapons, including 2 more Thompson submachine guns. Although senior police officials like Matt Leach publicly proclaimed that this was clearly an attempt to beef up an entire gang of bank robbers, especially after the recent prison break, historically it is now believed that Dillinger and Pierpont were also trying to send a more subtle message. Recently, groups of citizen vigilantes who, after the Sheriff Sarber incident, began organizing their own roadblocks and threatening to shoot the criminals on sight, understanding that any attempt to do this now would have to involve a virtual firefight with the outlaws wielding immense firepower, a rather intimidating prospect that would make any modestly armed civilian think twice. Leach was again correct in his prediction of additional imminent bank robberies. On October 23rd, 4 men got out of an automobile near the entrance to the Greencastle, Indiana Central National Bank of Greencastle. While one of these men, Russell Clark, waited by the entrance, 3 others, Pierpont, Dillinger, and Mackley, ventured inside. After Pierpont exchanged small talk with a teller as to whether a $20 bill he had was fake, he then pulled out a .45 and proclaimed that he was there to rob the bank. Simultaneously, Dillinger and Mackley opened their overcoats and produced submachine guns with the wooden stocks removed. While Mackley kept the main lobby area under control, Dillinger vaulted over the cashier cage railing, Pierpont merely entering the same area through an unlocked door. After removing any cash from the cashier area, Dillinger then put a pistol against the midriff of an employee and ordered him to open the bank's vault, which the man did quickly, Dillinger getting even more cash into his ever-present sack. Mackley even robbed 2 customers of the cash they were about to deposit. With the robbery seemingly going off without a hitch, Dillinger quickly left with his associates, cheerfully telling the terrified victims, "Take a good look at me, so you'll be sure to know me the next time you see me." Actually, during the commotion, a bank employee was able to slip out of the building and call the police. Perhaps deliberately, the crooks were long gone before any kind of law enforcement response, even able to circumvent a freight train obstructing the main entrance out of town. In their large, powerful automobile, a Studebaker, the bank robbers merely headed down a parallel dirt road and then proceeded south towards their new hideout in Terre Haute. Although the heist yielded a very substantial $32,000, this was the first time that unscrupulous bank management would seize upon the bank robbery epidemic to inflate their losses, in this case claiming to their insurance company that cash and bonds worth $75,000 were stolen. This was also one of the first Dillinger heists that was publicized nationally. Dillinger's terror gang prison escapes and robberies previously a regional phenomenon. This publicity was clearly affecting the behavior of other criminals in the Midwest. On the same day as the Greencastle heist in Brainerd, Minnesota, a former gas station attendant named Lester Gillis and other men robbed the First National Bank of Brainerd of $32,000. Gillis eventually teamed up with Dillinger. By then, he would be known by the pseudonym Babyface Nelson. Terre Haute quickly bored Pierpont and Dillinger, who also figured they would eventually be identified in such a small town. They decided to head to Chicago, other members of the crew following, but living separately throughout the huge city. During this time period, Pierpont and those responsible for killing Sheriff Sarber and springing Dillinger were indicted for murder in Lima, Ohio. For the criminals themselves, this would only underline the ferocity against any attempt at capture, understanding that they faced a likely death penalty. Although a city the size of Chicago afforded anonymity, it was also filled with snitches intent on collecting reward money for information about Dillinger and Pierpont. Tipped off that Dillinger would be present for, of all things, a doctor's appointment, a massive covert strike force waited for him afterwards. But Dillinger's instincts served him well, and he noticed what looked to be undercover police in the vicinity when he exited. He evaded most of the strike force team, only 1 car able to keep up with him. Additionally, it was felt at the time that law enforcement wanted him arrested and not killed, and despite shooting at his car, the police were unsuccessful in their attempts to disable the gangster's powerful Hudson terraplane. Although when the car, riddled with bullets, had to be abandoned, police traced Dillinger via the registration and other items in the car to his hideout address. But the outlaw got lucky again, relocating to another backup hideout elsewhere in the city. He quickly determined that having such a large amount of crew members was unwise, especially when some of the gang were unstable alcoholics like Harry Copeland, likely to be inappropriately talkative and indiscreet. Cut loose, it was only a matter of days before Copeland was arrested for drunk and disorderly and quickly identified by police as a Dillinger-Pierpont associate. Transported back to Indiana, he was grilled relentlessly by law enforcement from across the Midwest, an eventuality that forced many of the remaining bank robbers to relocate to Racine, Wisconsin, knowing that Copeland would divulge their previous hideouts. This relocation would be an unfortunate development for the American Bank and Trust Company of Racine and its employees, an almost immediate recipient of a November 20th, 1933 visit from 4 machine-gun-toting bandits, including Dillinger, Pierpont, Mackley, and Russell Clark. Mackley approached a closed cashier window and spotting teller Harold Graham, who had his back to the gangster, he loudly proclaimed, "Hands up!" Apparently, Graham did not respond with the appropriate attitude because it took another command to get him to turn around, and even then he didn't raise his hands. Mackley, probably overly nervous, then shot the bank employee, his machine gun on single fire. The teller collapsed to the floor, but was able to trip the bank's silent alarm, even though he was bleeding. Nonplussed, Dillinger and Pierpont headed to the vault while Mackley cleaned up the teller's cash drawers. They forced the bank's president to open it, which he quickly did. But this would be the first time that law enforcement actually arrived while a Dillinger holdup was in progress. 2 policemen, one armed with a Thompson, nonchalantly headed to the bank when the alarm sounded at police headquarters. The internal alarm had been sounding falsely for weeks, and they assumed that this would be another dud. Russell Clark was watching the front door and subdued the first cop inside, Officer Cyril Boyard. But when Clark saw Sergeant Wilbur Hanson enter with a submachine gun, he yelled to Mackley, who without hesitating shot the policeman with a pistol twice, Hanson falling to the ground. By now another external alarm was attracting attention, curious citizens wandering in the direction of the bank's entrance. Dillinger and Pierpont rounded up Boyard, the bank president, and several female employees and pushed them out of the front door as human shields. Getting into their getaway Buick, they restrained at least 3 hostages on the auto's running boards, preventing several members of law enforcement from shooting at them. One of these hostages, Policeman Boyard, was eventually shoved into the street and safely out of town. The other 2 were allowed to get into the car. They would be crudely tied to a tree by Pierpont, 30 miles out of town, and told to wait for 20 minutes before freeing themselves. Realizing that a lengthy return to Chicago was probably unwise and the Racine area was now no longer a viable hideout, Dillinger, Pierpont, and other gang members spent the next few months vacationing in various southern, warmer locales, mostly in the Jacksonville, Florida area. While they were gone, determined Chicago police would suffer 2 separate fatalities and shootouts with Dillinger-related individuals. John Hamilton, a Terrible 10 escapee, his body shop hideout revealed to the cops by an informer, killed a well-known police sergeant, William Shanley, in a shootout when Shanley, on his own, tried to arrest Hamilton, who escaped. Ed Schaus, a Terrible 10 alumnus who was cut loose over his overly attentive attitude towards Billy Frechette, was apprehended after a gun battle in which an Illinois state policeman was killed by friendly fire. Schaus was merely returned to Michigan City to serve out his sentence, but not before revealing more information about the Dillinger gang's habits and potential locations. Seemingly intelligent enough to understand that the greater Chicago and Indianapolis areas would have been no-go zones, Dillinger then did something that underlined his ferociously defiant personality. Returning from sunny Florida, Dillinger on January 15, 1934, pulled up to the First National Bank of East Chicago. Although the name might indicate it as a suburb of the city of Chicago, the town is actually slightly over the Indiana border, 25 miles away. Accompanied by John Hamilton and an unknown wheelman, Dillinger walked into the lobby of the large urban bank and removed a Thompson submachine gun from a leather case. He herded any customers against the walls of the open area, while Hamilton started rifling the cash drawers. But a bank employee hit the silent alarm, and the practically foolhardy robbery began to unravel, police only a block and a half away. Again, used to usually false alarms, four policemen nonchalantly walked through the bank's double doors, not expecting that they would be confronted by a machine gun-wielding John Dillinger. The first policeman, Hobart Wilgus, was immediately disarmed by Dillinger. The other three were able to escape outside. Hamilton continued to loot the bank's cash drawers to the tune of $20,000. Dillinger then forcing Dilgus and a bank vice president to walk in front of them as human shields, facilitating the thieves' exit. Again, the arrogance of Dillinger's choice of a target was underlined as an additional police car filled with officers had pulled up and had the bank surrounded. Additionally, one of the initial cops to respond, Sergeant William O'Malley, was hiding at the side of the entrance, figuring he would get a clear shot at Dillinger when the gangster passed in front of him, only a few feet away. He even yelled to Dilgus, the policeman able to flee, as O'Malley fired 4 shots directly into Dillinger's upper torso. Although knocked backwards, the bank robber didn't hesitate, immediately strafing the police sergeant with a fatal barrage, the incredulous onlookers not understanding that Dillinger and Hamilton were wearing steel-reinforced bulletproof vests. Hamilton foolishly began to chase Dilgus, giving up whatever hostage protection he had. Despite also wearing a vest, he was quickly felled by a bullet to the knee. Dillinger forced to fire his machine gun while scooping up his Confederate and stuffing him in the front seat of the getaway car and jumping into the back seat himself. Incredibly, the Buick V8 quickly pulled away, police unable to stop it despite unleashing a hail of gunfire. Although an open door was ripped off by the vehicle by a parked car, the getaway car escaped. Like some of his fellow gang members, Dillinger had now openly murdered a police officer. Privately, this behavior hardened the attitude of his pursuers, who resolved to shoot him on sight. The wounded Hamilton also made both outlaws' situation even more immediately precarious. With no choice but to head into central Chicago to find medical assistance, Dillinger had to resort to a formerly convicted abortionist to treat bullet wounds to Hamilton's arm and shoulder. Surprisingly, despite both men having to spend a lot of the stolen cash on the doctor's fee and various safe houses, Hamilton made a full recovery, eventually hiding out at the home of Fort Wayne relatives. Dillinger did not stick around Chicago and instead fled as far away as he ever had, picking up Billy Frechette, and after a few stops along the way, reconvened much of his gang in remote Tucson, Arizona. Mackley and Russell Clark checked into the Congress Hotel in downtown Tucson, while Pierpont and Dillinger rented nearby apartments, everyone accompanied by a female acquaintance. Charles Mackley previously spent time in Tucson and suggested it as so far away and small town that no one would even notice them. That assumption proved to be immediately problematic. Unusually lucky in his criminal career up to this point, Dillinger was about to experience an unfortunate set of circumstances. One was self-inflicted when a drunk Russell Clark bragged in the hotel bar to visiting salesmen that robbing banks was easy money, and even flashed his loaded revolver and a large amount of cash. The two men immediately reported the incident to police. The next morning, January 23, 1934, a defective oil burner in the basement of the hotel set fire to a nearby stack of firewood, igniting a blaze that destroyed the 3rd floor, caved in the roof, and defiled the entire hotel with water damage. Many hotel occupants needed assistance from fire crews and ladders to escape, and making it to the street, Mackley and Clark immediately offered members of the fire department a bribe to be let back in to retrieve their luggage. Subsequently emerging successfully with several suitcases, firemen observed that the luggage seemed to be not only extremely heavy, but obviously quite valuable to its owners. Local legend claims that upon returning to the firehouse, an observant fireman recognized both men as Dillinger gang members from a copy of True Detective magazine. Police were informed, and they were able to determine that the hotel delivered the luggage to a local 2nd Avenue location that Mackley and Clark had recently rented. With the house placed under surveillance, Mackley and his girlfriend were followed and arrested while running a local retail errand. Clark and his wife, Opal Long, a.k.a. Bernice Clark, were then arrested at this location after a brief struggle. Both Pierpont, Dillinger, and Billy Frechette were arrested within hours after showing up separately. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about John Dillinger. Information for this podcast came from the books John Dillinger by Dari Matera and Public Enemies by Brian Burrow. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at bitesizebiographies.com. Thank you for listening, and please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.